So a lot of people believe that Christ rose from the dead. Dom, do you,
Yes,
do
there are
you
many of
believe
us.
that?
I do, as a matter of fact. Um, I've been thinking a lot the past probably 3 days about. I know you know this, but just for the audience, our family is a very evangelical family. We do a lot of ministry, trying to like preach the Bible, which a lot of people hate. But I've been thinking a lot recently about how do we succinctly argue for the existence of God? Like, how do we come up with a great argument for the existence of God?
And
And
specifically for the proof that Christ rose from the dead. Is
right,
that
what? So
is
yeah,
that
that
kind of
that
what's on your mind right now?
yeah, so that's a part of it. I used to think like, oh, hey, we have to convince people that God exists and then that Christianity is true and that the Bible is true and then that they should follow the Bible like a series of steps. But I've realized in the past probably 3 days I've been thinking about this that we can probably skip that first step of trying to convince them um, whether or not God exists. Because if we can convince them that the resurrection is true and that God rose from the dead, then that implies that God exists, and it also implies that the rest of like Christianity is true.
Yeah, that flows logically. And one of the things I wanted to start by saying is I'm such a novice at this topic, but it's obviously one I've thought at least a little bit about. And the first thing that's immediately interesting to me is that I have this belief that everybody is everyone we're all presuppositionalists, meaning we all have this like foundational knowledge, or we're motivated by either what we were taught from the time we were little or by what we want our beliefs to be now. And that frequently people tend to follow the beliefs that they're comfortable with, and that's not like a really smart way to be, but it does tend to be how people are. And even though there's so many like contrasting points of view, um, truth exists. If you have 10 different people with 10 different ideas, they could either they're all wrong or one of them's right, or
Right,
maybe a couple could be right.
right.
But for me, I haven't really ever dug super deep into like, did Christ rise from the dead? What's the evidence? A lot of
Yeah,
people are evidence based and they need that evidence. And I might sound naive to say, like, I don't really need like that kind of evidence, because for me, there's all these other things that flow logically. And so anyway, I'm excited to hear some, research you've dug up. And I thought at some point I'll kind of get into my way of thinking about Christ and why I trust in him that isn't really so related to like direct evidence, as you might call it.
sure. Yeah, that makes sense. One quick point is you said about the different people who believe different things. I just want to comment real quick. A lot of the people will say this is really common nowadays, like, "Oh, that's my truth," or "Oh, that's your truth." It's like, no, no, don't. That's just that you can have your opinion, but you can't have your truth. There's just the truth, and that's it.
Right.
If your truth is different from my truth, then one of our truths is wrong for sure.
It seems like inevitably in conversations I end up in, somebody ends up saying like, well, what is truth? And
Yeah,
my, like
it's
you said, my truth versus your truth.
obfuscation
So,
and yeah.
somebody said like, what is four, the number four? I said, well, it's a construct that lets us know, a quantity that is greater than three and less than five. We could have called it banana or pickle or any other kind of food or something else that's
Yeah.
not a food.
As
And
Bill Clinton says, it depends on what your definition of is.
yeah, exactly. So that's another problem in this topic, but maybe a topic for another day, is just the problem of truth and how a lot of people seem to think it's like very fluid and my truth versus your truth. And that's not our topic today. But I just thought I'd touch on the fact that presuppositionalism is inherent. We all have these presuppositions, and it's good for all of us to really think about why we believe what we believe, what evidence we have. Do we have evidence? Is it just something that's been taught to us since we were little, and that's the only reason we believe it? So I just wanted to preface it with that.
Right.
So, what are your first thoughts
Which that
about?
is
Yeah,
yeah. So that is just the accusation that Christians get a lot, that like, oh, you just believe it because your parents believe it. Um, but yeah. So as far as like um, the resurrection and the evidence for it, um, a lot of the time I like to like when I'm trying to talk about the Bible, I like to point to sources outside of the Bible, because I think a lot of people they tend to just like say, oh, you know, you're trying to prove something in the Bible and you're using the Bible to do that. So no, I don't accept that. But so I'm actually not going to do that this time. I am going to point to the Bible to support my claims,
great.
especially the writings of Paul, and specifically First Corinthians 15. Um, now, First Corinthians was written around like 50, 53, 55 AD, somewhere around there, about like 20 or so years after Christ. Um, Now, scholars disagree about the authorship of like a lot of Paul's epistles, a lot of his letters, but pretty much for the most part, they all agree that Paul wrote First Corinthians. Um,
And if they agree that he wrote that, do they? What else do they agree about in terms of who he is as a person? Do they believe that he wrote that, and they also believe that he thinks at least that he saw Christ, like for a secular scholar?
yeah, well, I would get into that in a little bit. I wouldn't want to answer that quite yet. Um, because that kind of gets into the meat of my argument a little later
Okay,
on.
great.
Um, um, Now I would disagree with those scholars who say like, you know, Ephesians or Romans or whatever wasn't written by Paul. I would disagree with them, but that's not what I'm going to get into today. Um, but just so my point with this is that even the most skeptical of non-Christians will still agree that this was written by Paul, First Corinthians, and you know, and I'm not talking about like people in the YouTube comment section, like mainly like the scholarly people who criticize the
Scholarly,
Bible.
secular people, right?
Right, right,
And,
yeah,
and so they, so there is some consensus among scholarly, secular people, non-Christians, that this man named Paul did live, did write at least this letter to actual Corinthians. It's a genuine letter, and that he in some way obviously believed that Jesus Christ existed, and that these things happened.
right. Um, yeah, so they might disagree that like they might say, oh, he was insane or whatever, so he was just speaking gibberish, but
Sure.
they do agree that he did exist, and he did at least like think that he saw uh like Jesus and talked with him and whatnot.
Okay.
um but I would like to read a little bit of First Corinthians. This is chapter 15, and then talk about it a little bit. Um, so chapter 15, verse 1, I'll do 1 through like 7.5. Moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, and in which you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast that word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then the 12. After that, he was seen uh, by 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. Presumably, that means dead. Um, Verse 7. After that, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then, last of all, he was seen by me also. Um, so this tells us some basic facts about Jesus, right? Like including that he was crucified, he died, he was buried, he rose from the dead, and he appeared to 500 witnesses after he rose from the dead, and then he appeared to the apostles, and then to Paul. Um, but so now, like a lot of those scholars, they'll ask, like, well, like, oh, well, who is Paul? Well, Paul, he was like a strict Jew who, followed law. He followed the Jewish law, um, and he thought that believers were heretics. So he persecuted and killed them. Um,
Now, it says that in Acts, when we first meet Paul, he's, that's what he's doing. But so, do they believe that that's substantiated somehow? Do they, would a secular person read that and say, yes, that's a good definitive explanation for who this Paul is?
Yeah, no, I'm not totally sure. I haven't gotten it straight from the horse's mouth, but I would assume so, because in the letters that they do agree that he wrote, he says, "Hey, I did this awful stuff." Like even later in this chapter, he says like, "I am like a terrible person who did all this terrible stuff."
Right. Chief of
So
sinners.
right, yeah. So I would assume that they would believe that he did all this like garbage stuff essentially. Um, I don't think they would challenge that. They might, but not that I'm aware of, at least.
Okay, continue.
Yeah, but so he's persecuting the church, and he's rounding them up, killing them, yada yada yada, all this horribly evil stuff against the church. Um, but then something very sudden happened with him. There's a big sudden change. He went from persecuting the followers of Christ to being persecuted in the name of Christ. So he kind of did like a whole 180. He was killing them, and now he's one of them, and he's willing to be killed for their cause. Um, Now, to the skeptic, I'd ask, how do you like account for that? How does that make sense? This is someone who hated Christ to the point of like rounding up believers and killing them. So he loathes the church. Um, and this person isn't just not biased. He's literally as biased against the church as you can be. But then he becomes convinced that the church is correct, and he becomes a Christian. So this is the greatest skeptic of all time who says, actually, you know what? This Jesus stuff isn't fake. I believe it now. Then later he says, like, hey, because I persecuted the church, I wasn't even worthy to be called an apostle. But then after I saw Jesus after his resurrection, but then like I saw Jesus after his resurrection, and I can't deny that. So this is someone who was against Christ, who wanted him dead, and here he is saying that he rests his entire belief system on Christ's death and resurrection. He says that in verse 14. He says,
And I agree with that. That's so powerful. But so if you have a skeptic, don't a lot of skeptics just immediately dismiss the Bible? Frequently, it's based on like cliches, like, oh, it's been translated so many times, or, I mean, and think about fake news today, how there's like fake news everywhere. And it's like you almost don't know what's real because there's just so much different information everywhere. So if you're going to use the Bible as the source for the evidence, um, then how do you then take that the one step farther when you're trying to explain to a skeptic, well, look at this guy in the Bible. Scholars say that this letter is authentic. This man Paul lived. This is an actual letter he wrote. And we believe he's talking of the Jesus, obviously, that the whole world believes, well, that many people in the world, like 1 out of 5 people in the world, believes that he rose from the dead. And then when the skeptic says, well, I don't believe anything in that whole book.
yeah. So then you can get into a lot of the like, oh, well, like here's like this thing in the Bible that proves it's correct. Here's all these historical facts which line up with our like the like documents we find in archaeology, yada yada yada. But one thing I like to point out to a lot of those people is they act like the library is just like one big long story, and which I agree it is, but that was just made up, so we can just discount all of it. But it's a little more nuanced than that. The Bible is literally a library of different books, and it has all these books, and you just say like, oh, I don't believe anything in there. It's like if you're talking to one of them, you could say, well, like, okay, which book don't you believe, and why don't you believe that one? And usually, I don't think they could give you a good answer. I don't think that they're, some people might have some stuff against Exodus or Genesis that you would have to work through, but
Right.
for the rest
Like
of it,
Origins
right? Yeah,
specifically. And
exactly.
until what's the name of the series out with the all the Moses, about how the Exodus occurred, the new evidence, what's that called?
The patterns of evidence, and you
Patterns of
might not be able
evidence.
to see it. It's on the shelf behind me.
Oh, great. You've got
But
it in
yeah,
stock.
yeah, that's great. So highly recommend checking that out.
So
But
they might object to some books in the Bible, or they just have a cliche kind of ignorant objection. But just to be like completely honest, I feel like I have to some extent like some ignorance that I don't feel like I could adequately explain to someone that here is how we know, here is how the Bible came from the original authorship to where it is today. And that doesn't mean I feel like I don't believe it. I mean, I believe it wholeheartedly, but for me, I don't need that. And I do kind of wish that I understood how that happened better. Sometimes people, I've heard believers say that, um, I mean, it's almost kind of like a simple thing, there you had a time when people, it was the Jews, who had the Torah, the first five books, and then but I don't even know, like, how did the rest of the Bible, the rest of the Old Testament, it get added to that? There's Joshua, Judges, there's so many books, and then who was it who decided that all these books are canon, and then there's all these other books that aren't? And maybe this is a topic for another time,
yeah,
but I just want to be honest about my own shortcomings in this area and say I wish I knew more about it myself.
sure. And I would like to go down just a tiny little rabbit trail because it's a fun little tidbit. But I saw a super interesting article about how the early church decided what books um, were part of the Bible. And one of the measurements that they went through was they looked at things that Jesus quoted from, and they said if Jesus
Brilliant.
didn't like quote from these books, then that significantly goes against like how credible they are. Um,
Incredible. That's so brilliant.
yeah, so
So
they have a bunch of different standards, and that was one of the standards which would help your book get added to the canon.
now, so that means it's possible that there are some books that were removed because just coincidentally he did not quote from it.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm not prepared enough to
And
make
that's
a
fine. That
solid
was
case
just
one
a
way or another. But it's
random
fun. Yeah,
thought.
yeah, it's fun.
So I had some thoughts about, like, now we're sort of just on the topic of the Bible being reliable. And I agree with that. And that's my motivation for Christianity. One of like the primary, two or three that I have. Um, did you want to cover anything else? I thought I would tell you a couple of the thoughts I had, which I bet we're sort of eye to eye on.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, we could do that. There's definitely a lot of like points of evidence in the Bible. Um, but we could either continue with this or go with one of those points, whatever you want.
Well, I was just going to say that as far as the evidence for Christ's resurrection, I think it is tied to, for me, for my faith, it's tied to the belief that I believe I can trust the Bible. And the reason I believe I can trust the Bible, first of all, was like you mentioned, it's historically accurate. It has this information about people groups, genealogies, cities, political figures, kings, historical events, even astronomy, monetary units that different civilizations used. And archaeologists, they're not carrying a Quran or a Book of Mormon around with them when they're out
Right.
digging. They use a Bible for these very reasons. And that's not to say that those archaeologists believe in Jesus, but that says even more, I think, to the credit of the Bible, that they are secular. They don't believe some of what's in there, but they're still using it because it is such a reliable book of history. Something that I've always said, I don't know, I bet other people say this too, but is that as far as books of wisdom go, I, I haven't read, every book out there, but I don't think there's
Shame on
any,
you.
I don't think there's any book out there like the Bible that teaches so much about ourselves that is not intuitive. Things that we don't want to hear. Things like our hearts are deceptive above all things. In the
Right, totally.
multitude of counselors, there is safety. Like people don't want counselors. Like
Right.
if you go and talk to
Let me
somebody
do
and
my thing.
right and try to explain to them that what they're doing is wrong, and especially if you get like a big group of people together, like in the midst of in the multitude of counselors, then there's a lot of people that's like a, what do you call that when you get a whole bunch of people together, an
An intervention.
intervention.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people sometimes those are effective, of course, and I'm not trying to speak to the effectiveness of interventions, but I know a lot of times people can get even more hard-hearted. And then the Bible
Yeah.
even warns against its own followers, you know, saying, the people coming in my name could be bad.
Right.
That doesn't
Totally.
seem intuitive either. And it even explains how you could falsify Christianity. So, and there's so much more. I mean, we could probably make a list of 30 things. So that might be a fun show to do.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, with falsifying Christianity, that's in this chapter, 1 Corinthians 15, he says, if Christ did not rise from the dead, our preaching and our belief is empty.
Exactly.
So,
What kind of book would put that in there where normally if you're trying to make a case, you're trying to build some like fake thing, fake news, fake whatever, and you want people to follow it, you try to make it sound like the best, greatest possible thing that's like completely irrefutable. And they have the humility and the wisdom to include that kind of information in the Bible. Like, well, here's how you falsify Christianity.
yeah.
And so and that's
So,
the topic of this whole talk.
which that's another, that doesn't, I'm not saying it's like you're saying that proves the Bible, but that's one thing that really strongly like attests to the credibility of the Bible, is like it's saying, hey, look, we have confidence, we'll give you a few points, like if you can prove like this and this, we're wrong. So like it's like trying to pull off someone's fingernails. They will resist you as hard as they can if you try and say like, well, okay, atheist, if you realize XYZ, will you admit we're right? They say no, like to everything. But here, the Bible, it's just right in there, right at the heart of it. Just if
Totally.
we're wrong about this, we're wrong about everything.
Right. And I had one last like category of things that make the Bible amazing and why I believe it. And there's others too, but these are like the three biggest ones that came to my mind. The next was, have you ever read another book that works so hard to illustrate that all of the main characters and even the book's own authors are horrible, horrible people? Like Israel rebelled incessantly. Moses wasn't even allowed to enter the promised land. Peter rejected Christ. Paul called himself, like you said before, chief of sinners. And so if a bunch of people just made up the Bible, they really wanted you to know that they were huge hypocrites and losers. And, that's not the kind of story you tell if
Right.
you want people to follow a belief system. Like diets are belief systems. And imagine if you read a diet book, you open it up and it starts off by saying, well, 4,000 people died on this diet last year and 2,000 people were hospitalized. And oh, me, the author, by the way, I'm a murdering adulterer alcoholic. Uh,
I
yeah,
want to buy it.
that's a great way to start a belief book. So,
Yeah.
so that, I don't know.
Yeah, no. If I was making up a story about my ancestors, I would pretend that they're kings or princes or gods or whatever. I wouldn't say like, oh, they're a bunch of like lying scumbags who cheated on their wives and yada yada yada.
Yeah, it's
So
completely unintuitive. And so just the Bible has the flavor of realism. And and so that's like my primary reason why I believe it. And I'm a presuppositionalist. I just like everyone is, secular people are too. Public school is mostly what pumps you know information into most people's heads, sadly, in the U.S. today. But for me,
right.
my parents raised me this way, and then I did have a moment where I started to doubt and think maybe I'm not a Christian. When I was like 19 or whatever. And then ultimately I came back on the path, and I did start doing research. but I've never specifically researched this topic. Did Christ rise from the dead? It was just always like, is the
No,
Bible true? Who created the world? What was that?
right. Yeah. No, I was just saying that's a fun one. It's a fun topic, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So what are your other arguments?
Yeah. Well, so just to like continue with where I was, let me see, find myself in my notes real quick. Give me a second. Sorry about this. Um, but so, anyways, this is Paul. Um, he becomes convinced that the church is correct, and he becomes a Christian. This is the greatest skeptic of all time. Goes saying he says, you know what, Jesus stuff isn't fake. Um, I believe it now. Um, so it's like the greatest skeptic of all time now agreeing. And this is obviously someone who he knows what's going on, right? He's very involved in this. He's alive at the time that it's happening. He's inclined against God and everything God stands for. Yet what does he do? Like he says, you know, this is too compelling. I'm going to switch my entire belief system over 180. And if you are a resurrection skeptic, there's no like great way to explain why a rational human being would have a complete change of heart unless this was actually true.
Yeah,
You'd have
that
to say that like he went insane.
right. Or they would just say, I don't believe the whole thing. But you're
Right,
saying,
which as far as the scholars go, that's not, they don't, in terms of like refuting the like scholarly like held position. So it's going to
now
be a little different, the conversation with every individual.
since a secular scholar does not believe that Christ rose from the dead, is there an issue with them? Do they take issue with, obviously they do, with Paul saying that I also saw Jesus? And
Right. Well, so, or go ahead.
and well, wouldn't that be tied in obviously to part of why he became so emphatic and so devoted to this ministry? And so
Right.
if they disagree with that, I guess I should ask this: do they have any basis for which to doubt? What is the basis on which they doubt, other than just rejecting the resurrection? Why do they reject that Paul could have met Jesus, other than just rejecting the resurrection?
Right. So there tends to be pretty much three options. You might have heard of like C.S. Lewis's 3 L's, like Jesus was either a liar, a lunatic, or a legend. And there's something kind of like that with Paul, which I think works a little bit better, which is that he was either telling the truth about seeing Jesus after Jesus died, that he was a pathological liar, or that he was a lunatic. And if you're going to say that Paul was not telling the truth, then you really have to explain why you think he was a pathological liar or a lunatic. And that's surprisingly more difficult than you might think, because we have his writings. We know what he says. We know that he's um, the things that like he writes, he's a very like humble person. He's very willing to share about his own struggles and whatnot.
Right. And he
And
wasn't living a life of luxury. He was like
right, totally.
traveling constantly, had nothing, didn't even have a
Right.
wife.
And he was being persecuted for, sharing the gospel. So it's like he does all this stuff, and he's super humble, and lying is not like, being a liar and being humble do not go very well together. But you have all this stuff, like, why would he lie? He gets nothing out of lying. He's a very humble, respectable, like, he has a lot of integrity. Why would he lie? The burden of proof shifts to the skeptics to say why he was a liar. And in my opinion, they don't have much to back it up to say he's
That's
lying.
another thing I've never understood, is that seems to be their main argument against the Bible in general, that it was written by people who have some ulterior motive. But when you ask them, okay, well, what was that motive? It's that's not a question that I've ever heard answered. It's like, why did these people write this fake book, the Bible? Why did this guy Paul make up this story?
Right. Yeah.
especially when it's so self-condemning.
Mm-hmm.
And
And the more specific you get to, the better. Like, why would Paul lie about this? What did he have to gain from it? Whereas some people might say, like, oh, the Bible is just a bunch of tales. It's like, well, get a little more specific here, and then maybe we'll be able to work from there. You can't just broad statements and then expect to hold that to hold up as a worldview.
totally. And I guess they haven't thought through it further than that. And I can relate because I haven't thought through this further than how far I've thought it through.
Right.
So where we're at right now is that Paul was he was either telling the truth, lying, or he was insane. And like you said, the two options of, lying or insane are hard to prove. And so therefore you're just saying, it's okay to logically conclude he was telling the truth because there's not really any kind of motivation you can find for lying. And insane, I guess, what would they say about that? Like, why are all these cities all over the world paying attention to him, taking him in, listening to him, taking his letters, following him?
Yeah. So it's like if you do disagree that like Paul has credibility to anyone who's listening, it's like go read his epistles, go read his letters. It's obvious he's not a liar, but like you might think he's crazy, right? That was the other option. And so you could think he's a madman, that he went insane on his trip to Damascus, he hallucinated, and then he started like traveling the lands preaching gibberish. But if you're reading it, like you see Paul's teaching. We have the letters he sent and the ideas he shared, but they're not the writings, they're not the teachings of a madman. They all agree with the historical facts of the Bible. They all the things are brilliant. There's amazing lessons in them. They're consistent with each other, which like insane people can't do. And to top it off, these teachings were persuasive enough to convince large chunks of skeptical people, and not to mention the church who he persecuted. At like he killed these people in the church, and his writings were so like persuasive and like intelligent that they convinced that church that he persecuted to give him their right hand of fellowship. And so lunatics do not possess that ability to win over the people they had tried to kill, right? So he was a brilliant man. He was a philosopher. He was a deep thinker. He knew what he saw. He wouldn't have been fooled into believing the resurrection by some cheap tricks. So that, in my opinion, it goes to show that he cannot just be a crazy lunatic. And it seems like the only reasonable explanation is that he's telling the truth.
So you basically have to just reject it outright, just on the basis that you don't want to believe it. And if you start to dig in, it starts to become messy in terms of trying to explain historically how it's inaccurate, or just like what his motivation could have been. If it's not, like, if you want to just say Paul never existed, this is all just made up, that's just rejecting it outright without any kind of basis. Or if you're,
when you do that, you disagree with the like scholarly people on your side, so you have to reject other atheists who you like uphold. You always hear people say, "Oh, I don't believe in the Bible. I believe in science." Then you have to start disregarding those scientists or historians that make fun of Christians.
So if you're watching this and you never thought about it, there's people
You're
on your side who think the Bible was at least written by the people who say they wrote it. And you have to figure that out. Why did they say all this stuff? Why did Paul, and then Dom, am I spoiling the end of the story that he died? He was boiled in oil for his beliefs, and all the other apostles were stoned. Peter was crucified upside down. I mean, what were these people thinking if it wasn't because they had seen? I mean, and think about Peter. He rejected Christ. He had a huge transformation
3
too.
times,
Yeah, he rejected him. He, out of fear, they're about to kill Christ, and he's like, "No, I don't know this guy. Leave me alone." And then just a little bit later, he's dying for Christ. And why are people going to die for a lie. They're not going to.
Right.
Why? Just to perpetuate this story that's all been made up for thousands of years by people they didn't know, and now they're continuing the story. Why? For
Yeah.
no reason, just to make themselves look bad and die. That's the
Yeah.
argument.
Yeah, it's bizarre. If I'm an atheist who doesn't believe in God and I want to spread some lie just because I'm bored and I want to see the world burn or whatever, it's like the second someone says I'm gonna like punch you, I'm like, okay, never mind. I don't care about this. I'm out of here. So, but you're thinking that all these thousands of people for like thousands of generations, thousands of years, they none of them agreed with that line of logic. So yeah, it's bizarre.
Well, awesome. I don't know if we're done. Did you have more, like a totally different line? I only got to see your notes based on this one topic of Paul. Did you have any other evidence?
Um, I do have a little bit, but I would prefer to get into that on a different day. I don't feel like I could make the strongest case right now with how much I've prepared, but I would like to get into that at some point in the future. Who knows when?
Perfect. Well, I didn't know all this stuff from the beginning. So thank you so much for teaching me, Mr.
Yes.
Dominic, you smart
Thank you,
man.
Brian. Oh well, I don't know how to respond to compliments. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Well, that'll conclude this episode of whatever our show is. Thanks
Yes,
for watching.
and I do plan on, with your permission, posting this on my YouTube channel. So, hello to everyone at the Dominic Enyart Show. This is an excerpt of the. Have we come up with a name for our show yet?
Well, I was running with Back to Basics. We kind of
Back
called
to
it like
basics.
Average Joe. You like
Average Joe.
Back to the Basics. I don't
Yeah,
know what to
whatever it
call
is.
it. The point of whatever the name is just that we're just like kind of normal guys, just talking through things. Neither of us are scholars. You're a smarter guy than me. You were homeschooled. I was public schooled. And so you teach me most of the time. You're almost always teaching me something, even though I
I didn't do
sometimes talk
drugs.
more.
That was
That
the whole
helps.
thing.
That helps a lot. I smoked a lot of pot, did a lot of other stupid junk. Anyway, we'll get more into that another time. For now, I'm going to go ahead and end this. And thanks again, Dom.
Cool. Thanks, guys. God bless.